I knew I was dying long before I found the strength to admit it, for the truth announced itself in the quiet ways a body fails. First in the numbing of my fingers as they tried, and failed to curl around the lasgun lying inches from my hand. Then in the strange, floating hush that settled inside my chest where breath should have been. A hush so deep it felt as if my own heartbeat were stepping back from me, growing distant, hesitant, unsure whether it wished to continue. And as I lay there on the broken earth with the smoke of a half-burned battlefield drifting in slow, ghost-like ribbons overhead, I felt my thoughts begin to slip into that soft, fragile place where time stretches thin and every sound becomes muffled, as though filtered through layers of cloth. And I told myself that if I wished to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. For this is the moment where my memories loosened and began to spill out like water from a cracked vessel, each one rising into my mind with a clarity cruel enough to be tender. The world around me shimmered with heat and the faint metallic scent of spent charge packs, but it all felt strangely distant, as though the land itself had shifted a step away, leaving me in a small pocket of stillness untouched by the thunder of artillery or the ragged screams carried faintly across the plain. And in that stillness, I felt a profound loneliness settle into my chest, heavier than pain, heavier than fear, a loneliness born from the quiet realization that no medic was coming. No reinforcements were near, and no brother-in-arms had even noticed me fall among the tangle of brush and shattered barricades where I now lay half-hidden. I tried to remember when the shot had struck me, or how far I had run before my legs folded beneath me like softened metal, but the memories were blurred around the edges, softened by shock and the strange, dreamy calm that now wrapped itself around my mind like a heavy cloak. And the more I reached for them, the more they drifted away, leaving only fragments. The flash of enemy fire cutting through the haze, the sudden weightlessness in my limbs. The ground rising to meet me with a gentleness completely at odds with the violence that had thrown me down. I closed my eyes then, more out of exhaustion than intent, and the darkness behind my eyelids felt warm, almost comforting. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine that I was lying not on a battlefield, but on the dusty hillside of my childhood home, where the air smelled of dry grass and sun-baked stone instead of burnt ozone and fear, and where my younger self had once dreamed of a future far different from the one the Imperium had carved into me. The memory rose sharp and sweet. A younger version of myself standing barefoot by the creek that cut through our settlement, water running cold around my ankles, sunlight flashing like scattered coins across the surface. And though the image lasted only a heartbeat before dissolving, it left behind a faint ache that spread through me like warmth returning to cold hands. When I opened my eyes again, the sky above me was the same gray-stained canvas it had been moments before, but it looked softer now, the drifting smoke blurring into gentle shapes, as if even the war had grown weary of tearing itself apart and had decided to sigh instead of roar. And in that softened world, I felt my breath hitch in a slow, uneven rhythm, my chest rising less each time, as though my body were already beginning to forget the pattern it had followed since birth. A wind moved faintly across the field then, carrying with it the distant sound of boots trampling through mud, the faint clatter of armor, the muted calls of officers shouting orders too far away for me to follow. And though these sounds should have stirred fear or urgency, They washed over me like ripples across a still pond, gentle and strangely calming, reminding me that the world was still moving even as my small corner of it quietly dimmed. I tried to speak once, tried to call out for help, or perhaps simply to reassure myself that my voice still existed, but the air slipped weakly from my throat, forming nothing more than a thin breath that vanished before it even reached the open sky. And in that failure, I felt something inside me loosen, some final thread of denial breaking in silence as I accepted that I would not rise from this place, that I would not see the regiment again, that my name would be recorded in a list of the fallen without ceremony, without remembrance, without even the certainty that my body would be found. Yet even as that truth pressed itself into me, I felt a curious softness settle across my thoughts, a gentle surrender that asked nothing of me, demanded nothing, simply invited me to let go of the fear I had clung to so tightly in the first moments after I fell. And so I let it wash through me, let it ease the trembling in my mind, until the battlefield felt less like a place of death and more like a quiet room where I could finally lay down the heavy weight of duty that had shaped my life for as long as I could remember. The pain in my side still existed, sharp and deep, but it felt far away now, softened by the distance growing between my body and my awareness. And as the warmth of my own blood seeped slowly into the ground beneath me, I found myself thinking not of the war, not of the emperor, not even of the regiment, but of small, gentle things. My mother's hands brushing dust from my hair, the smell of bread baking in the communal ovens, the quiet nights spent staring at stars long before I ever knew the names of the worlds. Those points of light would one day demand I fight upon. And in those thoughts, I felt a flicker of peace rise within me, fragile but real. The sky dimmed slightly as a cloud passed overhead, casting a cooler shadow across my body. And in that dimness, I felt my vision blur for the first time, not from tears, not from fear, but from the slow, inevitable fading of everything, each blink becoming heavier than the last, each breath quieter, each heartbeat softer, until the world around me felt like a distant echo I could no longer fully hear. And as the darkness pressed gently against the edges of my sight, I let my thoughts drift one final time toward the memories that had shaped me, letting them rise and fall like quiet waves, knowing that soon even they would slip from my grasp. And as the cool hush of fading awareness wrapped itself around me, I understood with a calm, weary certainty that this was the beginning of the end, the moment where life loosens its hold and allows the soul to speak one last time before all falls silent. From the moment the world shrank to the press of cold earth beneath my jaw and the dull warmth of my blood soaking the soil, pain taught me how silence is shaped, not as an absence, but as a careful architecture built from what remains when noise has been pared away. And it taught me with a merciless tenderness that cut clearer than any blade. The lesson began small and stubborn. A finger that would not close around my lasgun no matter how I willed it. A chest that refused to swell with the simple ritual of breath. A taste of iron that sat constant on my tongue until it became the only honest sense left to hold me tethered to the moment. At first, the silence felt like mercy, a kind of muffling that softened the edges of explosions and the ragged shouts of men, as though the world itself took a step back to give me room to breathe even as my body betrayed me. But that peace taught me a harder truth. That silence removes the distractions and lets you hear what you have carried inside you all your life. The small, ordinary things you never thought to thank the world for until they are gone. Memory arrived then not as a tide but as a sequence of small lights. My mother's hand steadying a bowl as dawn spread thin and gold across our yard. The creak of the mess hall door when my name was called for a late watch. The ridiculous, bright laugh of a boy I thought of as family because we had shared rations and fear. The exact way the lasgun felt against my shoulder when I first stood watch and believed the world could still be kept in order. Each recollection was sharp enough to sting and soft enough to cradle. The contrast between the vividness of these recollections and the muffled, distant roar of the battle beyond them made the silence feel like a room that was finally allowing me to speak aloud the truths I had kept folded up like a patched blanket. Pain, however, kept correcting me. It would flare and the memory would recede, or it would tighten its grip and the thought would sharpen into a knife. There were long minutes, what might have been hours, when I drifted along the seam between thought and nothing, and in those drifting stretches the lesson deepened. Silence forces you to listen to your own smallness, and that is both a kind and a terrible thing, because in that listening you find the unadorned face of who you are, not the uniform, not the slogans, not the neat categorizations by rank or merit, but the messy, stubborn little self who loved a woman's bread, who feared thunderstorms twice as much as war, who once let a child sit on his boots and tell him a story about a moon that danced on rivers. There is a cruelty in remembering such gentleness while the body fails, an ache that runs deeper than any wound, because the tenderness of those moments becomes an accusation. You see what you will not have again. Around me, the battlefield continued, as if unwilling to be interrupted by my small candle gone guttering. Distant detonations stitched into the gray sky, silhouettes moving like slow ghosts across far ridgelines, the occasional staccato crack of a weapon close enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Yet each sound curled into the silence around me and became less a summons than a witness, something that acknowledged my ending without demanding more of me. I found myself cataloging small, private things in a hurried, clumsy way, as if making sure they would not fall through some unseen grate. The smell of oil on a sergeant's hands, the precise cadence of a prayer muttered before dawn, the way frost had once rimmed the rim of a communal mug and glittered like a promise. In the hush, pain taught me another lesson. That regret is not always a thunderous thing. It often comes as a soft, repetitive suggestion, a small pebble thrown again and again into a pond until the ripples grow large enough to be felt. I thought of the orders I had followed without question, the faces I had never asked about because it was easier to keep them under a rank and file label, the favors left undone because there was always a next mission, and each tiny omission pressed on me like a weight. Yet the silence also revealed a compassion I had not expected. Without the noise of performance or the pressure of command, my mind could finally hold the names of those I had loved and lost without the excuse of duty to blur their edges, and somehow that made an ache into a softer thing, a memory warmed and made useful by the very fact I could hold it deliberately, as if preparing it to be offered somewhere beyond this field. Time shrank, long periods compressed into a single, remembering breath, And in that compression, the architecture of silence did its final work. It stripped away pretense until confession arrived almost naturally. A low, private reckoning not performed for others, but for the small man who had stood watch all his life and was now learning how to let go. I do not know how long I lay there cataloging and confessing to myself. Perhaps minutes, perhaps the long, slow arc of a night. But at some point the pain eased enough that the last thing that came to me was not a battle cry or a final oath, but a simple, honest thought. Forgive the things I could not change. Bless the small mercies I had. And if there is a hand to hold mine beyond this field, let it be gentle. As the light around the edges of my vision grew softer, as breaths became fewer, and my awareness folded like a map closing, pain's tutelage left me with quiet clarity. Silence will teach you everything you will need to know when the rest of the world has stopped insisting you be strong. And in that knowledge, I found a kind of small peace that felt less like victory than like the easing of a clenched hand. The moment I accepted that my legs would never again lift me from the earth, a strange and tender unraveling began inside me, as though the body, finally relieved of the burden of endurance, opened a quiet door through which memories slipped in soft procession. Not frantic or demanding, but gentle, almost reverent, as if they knew this was the last time they would be allowed to visit. The world around me had dimmed into a pale blur of shifting smoke and muted sky, shapes losing their edges, sounds softened into distant murmurs that no longer carried meaning. And in that fading, I discovered that the mind, freed from the demands of survival, becomes a chamber where the past walks with unhurried steps, each remembrance rising like a small lantern in the dusk of consciousness. I remembered first the sound of boots scuffing across the training yard back, when I still believed the guard would make a man of me, before I understood that war does not sculpt but strips, reducing the self to whatever remains when fear and duty have eaten everything else. I remembered the weight of my first lasgun, the way the metal had felt impossibly cold against my cheek as I took aim for the very first time, my hands trembling not with dread but with a fierce, naive pride that seems almost foreign to me now, as though that young recruit belonged to another lifetime entirely. Then came a memory so vivid and delicate it made the breath catch faintly in my throat. A night on leave, sitting beneath the half-lit glow globes outside the barracks, sharing a ration bar with a friend whose laughter had always reminded me of the way sunlight used to break through the window slats of my childhood home. I had forgotten the exact lines of his face until that moment, but his voice arrived effortlessly, warm and bright, unscarred by the years that would follow. And with it came the ache of realizing how many faces had blurred into anonymity because war had demanded I bury them to make room for the next mission, the next commander, the next loss. I thought of home next, not as a place but as a series of sensations. The feel of soil beneath my bare feet, the scent of smoke rising from our hearth as evening settled in, the distant call of livestock across the fields, the soft hum of my mother's voice as she worked beside the window, her presence a steady beacon in a world I did not yet know would demand so much of me. I had left that world believing I was stepping into purpose, into honor, into something greater than the small, quiet life I had known. But lying here now with blood cooling against the earth, I realized that greatness had never been what I longed for. I had only wanted to matter to someone, to something. And perhaps the cruelest truth was that I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth that I had forgotten to cherish the fleeting moments when I had already possessed it. As these memories drifted through me, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a cool breeze brushing my cheek with a touch so soft it felt almost like a hand trying to coax me back from the dimming edges of awareness. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered if someone had found me. Another guardsman, a medic, anyone who might anchor me again to the world. But the faint sounds remained distant, unfocused, as though carried across a widening gulf that no longer allowed the living to reach me. And I understood then that the movement I sensed was not a presence drawing near, but the slow turning of my own mind toward its final reflections. More memories rose, smaller ones, quieter ones, the kind you lose track of during the long march of duty. The way my boots had felt too big during my first deployment, the warmth of soup shared from a dented tin during a snowbound night on Vasca VII, the dry humor of a sergeant who had taught me how to rewrap a bandage with more care than he ever showed himself, the faint tremor in my hands after my first true combat encounter, a tremor I had tried so very hard to hide even though every man around me had carried the same silent shaking. I remembered a letter, too, creased so many times it had nearly fallen apart. A letter I had kept tucked inside my uniform since the day I received it. I could not recall the words now, not fully, but I remembered the way it had smelled faintly of home, of dusty rooms and sun-warmed fabric, and how I had read it during every quiet moment until the edges softened and the ink smudged beneath my thumbs. I wished I had it with me now. Wished I could read it once more before the world dimmed completely. But instead I held the memory of it gently, letting it rest in the tangle of my thoughts like a final gift. Pain flickered again in my side, faint and distant, no longer sharp enough to command but steady enough to remind me that my body still clung to its last thread of function. And with that flicker came a wave of exhaustion, so deep it felt like sinking, as though the earth beneath me had opened into a soft current pulling me downward into some quiet place where the noise of battle could not follow. In that sinking, I found no terror, only a strange tenderness, as though the world itself were preparing me for the moment when even memory would loosen and fade. My breath grew shallower, each inhale a small, fragile effort that seemed to take a little more from me, and the sky overhead blurred into a pale wash of shifting light. The drifting smoke stretched thin and luminous as if trying to soften the view for me. And as the details of the world slipped gently out of focus, the last memories that came were not of war or duty or even regret, but of voices, soft voices, from long ago. The sound of my father calling me in at dusk, the playful chatter of my younger sister as she chased insects through the grass, the quiet hum of my mother's lullabies that had soothed me through nights far gentler than this one. These voices rose and fell like a tide, washing through the dimming chamber of my awareness until they became indistinguishable from the whispering breeze, blending into a single, comforting sound that eased the tightening in my chest. And as I let them fade into the slow rhythm of my failing breath, I understood that the things I remembered now, at the end, were not the grand moments of valor or the fierce cries of battle, but the small, tender fragments of a life I had lived without realizing how precious each ordinary second had been. And with that understanding, a quiet peace unfolded inside me, soft as a blanket being drawn up across a weary body, and I let myself sink a little deeper into the earth, into the memories, into the gentle dark that waited to gather me in its arms. From the moment the memories softened into a distant hum and the world around me dimmed into that strange twilight where sound loses its edges and light forgets its purpose, I felt another presence gathering, not in the physical sense, not as footsteps or shadows or figures stepping through the drifting smoke, but as a quiet pressure against the edges of my fading awareness, a subtle weight that made the air around me feel thicker, as though the battlefield itself had begun to lean closer in a gesture of solemn recognition. And in that closeness I sensed them, the countless lost, the ones who had fallen long before me, the ones whose names had never been spoken aloud after their last breath, their lives swallowed by the same indifferent soil that now cradled me. They did not appear as shapes or spirits. They rose instead as impressions, faint echoes that brushed across the dimming surface of my thoughts like the soft sweep of a hand over dust. At first it frightened me, not with sharp terror, but with a small tightening in what remained of my chest, a quiet bewilderment that mingled with the thin thread of life still clinging to my ribs. But the sensation grew gentler the longer it lingered, settling into something almost familiar, like hearing murmured voices behind a door you once walked through every day. These ghosts, if that is what they truly were, carried no malice, no judgment, only the soft weight of presence, as though they wished to remind me that I was not the first to lie forgotten in the shadows of a battlefield, and that there was a certain dignity, a certain shared humanity, in the way our endings intertwined across time and soil. In their presence, I felt a strange stirring, not of fear, but of recognition, because as the echoes gathered, small flickers of memory that were not entirely my own drifted to the surface. A man kneeling behind a scorched supply crate, whispering a final prayer as the night pressed in around him. A woman clutching a locket to her chest, lips moving silently as she watched a burning sky collapse above her. A youth barely old enough to shave, gripping his rifle with trembling fingers and trying so desperately to remember the face of someone who had once called him brave. These impressions washed through me like waves, not sharp or clear enough to become true memories, but strong enough to leave imprints, faded outlines that tugged at my heart with an empathy so deep it hurt more gently than any wound I carried. I realized then that the guard loses more than bodies. It loses entire worlds, worth of small, unspoken stories, each one swallowed by the churn of war, each one extinguished before anyone learns who they truly were. And now, lying here at the edge of my own fading, I felt the quiet sorrow of that truth settle into me with the same heaviness as my own regrets. I wondered how many of these unseen companions had fallen near others who never noticed their final moments, how many had slipped into the soil without the dignity of a name spoken over them, and whether I, too, would simply become another whisper among these countless unremembered voices. The thought should have frightened me, but instead it brought a strange calm, as though knowing I would join this quiet company eased the loneliness of dying unseen. The air grew cooler then, a soft breeze brushing over my face with the faint scent of dust and smoke. And within that breeze, I sensed the shifting of these ghost-like impressions, gathering closer not to pull me away, but to bear witness, to hold space for my final hours the way none of my living comrades could. Their nearness brought with it another wave of strange, delicate memories, moments that tasted of loss but carried no bitterness. Someone humming softly while cleaning their weapon beneath a flickering lantern. Someone else tracing the outline of a child's drawing tucked into their uniform. The warm laughter of men sitting around a fire built from broken supply pallets. The small acts of kindness performed in shadows where officers never thought to look. These were not my memories, and yet somehow they were, woven together by the shared threads of fear, duty, and longing that bound every guardsman, no matter the regiment, no matter the world they came from. And with each borrowed memory, I felt a little less alone. As the fog of pain drifted in gentle swells across my thoughts, I realized that these ghosts were not here to haunt me, but to remind me of the humanity we all carried into the maw of war, of the tenderness we tried to protect even as everything around us insisted we abandon it, of the quiet truths that lived in the spaces between our orders and our obedience. Their presence became almost companionable, and as my breath grew thinner, I imagined them settling beside me in the dirt, not as spectral figures, but as echoes of the countless lives that had once pulsed with the same fragile hope that now flickered inside my failing body. I found myself speaking to them, not aloud, for my voice had grown too thin, but within the private chamber of my thoughts, offering them the prayers I no longer had strength to form with my tongue, asking silently that they remember me as one of their own, as another small soul who had tried in earnest to serve a cause too vast to comprehend. In return, I felt a warmth, not physical but emotional, a soft pressure that rested against my fatting awareness like a hand placed gently on my shoulder. And in that warmth, I understood something quietly profound. Even forgotten men leave echoes behind. Even nameless deaths ripple outward into the hearts of those who come after. And even the smallest life adds a thread to the immense, sorrowful tapestry of the Imperium. My vision blurred again, the distant shapes of smoke and sky dissolving into a hazy softness that reminded me of drifting off to sleep as a child while listening to my mother hum her lullabies. And as my eyes closed, not in effort but in surrender, I felt the ghosts lean closer, so close they seemed woven into the very air around me. Their presence was neither cold nor frightening. It was as gentle as the brush of twilight against the skin, as soothing as the final exhale at the end of a long day. And in that closeness, I felt my breath grow quiet, my heartbeat soften into a faint, irregular rhythm, and my thoughts begin to loosen like threads slipping free from a worn piece of cloth. As I drifted deeper into the dimming world, I carried with me the small comfort that I would not leave this place entirely unseen, that the lost were watching, listening, remembering in their own quiet way. And though they did not know my name, and I did not know theirs, we were bound by the simple truth that none of us had died alone. Not truly. Not while the echoes of our lives lingered in the weary hearts of those who came after, waiting gently for another soul to join their silent company. From the moment the final warmth in my limbs began to ebb and the air around me settled into a fragile, trembling stillness. I felt prayer return, slowly, hesitantly, as though it had been waiting at the edge of my consciousness for the moment when need, not duty, would call it home. And as the faint ache in my chest deepened into a distant pressure that felt more like memory than pain, I understood why the old men back in the regiment used to say the Emperor hears only the dying. Because only in these final breaths does the noise of the galaxy fall quiet enough for a whisper to reach whatever distant throne holds his silence. I tried at first to form the old invocations, the structured prayers recited in drills or muttered before battle, but they crumbled on the edges of my thoughts, their words brittle and hollow now that death had crept close enough to soften the need for ceremony. And instead, what rose was something simpler, something shaped not by doctrine, but by the small, vulnerable truths of my fatting heart. It was strange how gentle everything felt now, the wind brushing my cheek like a cool hand, the distant thunder of artillery softened into a muted rumble that felt more like waves crashing on a far shore. Even the ache of my wound seemed to have loosened its grip, as though my own flesh had decided to spare me one last kindness. I breathed in what little air my lungs would take, the motion shallow and uneven, and let the first words of my private prayer form within me. Not spoken aloud, not wished in desperation, but offered like a child's uncertain confession. See me, remember me, let me not fade into nothing. The ghosts that lingered around me seemed to draw back slightly, giving space for the quiet ritual unfolding inside my dimming awareness, and their distance felt almost reverent, as though they, too, understood that this was not a moment to witness but one to honor. My thoughts turned upward then, toward the sky I could barely see through the haze, toward the distant light of a sun slipping behind drifting smoke, and though I could not lift my head, I felt as though some inner part of me were reaching, stretching thin and fragile toward the faint idea of something greater than the war, greater than the Imperium, greater even than the sum of all the lives lost beneath banners that fluttered over too many graves. I wondered then, quietly, without bitterness, if the Emperor truly heard the dying, or if that belief was simply the last comfort we allowed ourselves in a galaxy that had so little mercy to spare. But even as the question formed, I felt it soften, lose its sharpness, because the truth no longer mattered. In these last breaths, belief itself was enough, a fragile lantern held close against the dark. My mind drifted through the prayers I had heard from chaplains, from comrades, from desperate voices in the quiet hours before dawn missions, and though I could not gather any single one in its entirety, their fragments floated through me like scraps of worn fabric. Guide me, forgive me, hold me, carry me home. I clung to these fragments not as ritual, but as comfort, letting them wrap gently around the fading edges of my awareness. A sudden flicker of memory rose then, unexpected, tender, a moment from childhood when a traveling preacher had visited our settlement, his voice hoarse yet warm as he spoke of the Emperor not as a god of war but as a beacon in the dark, a hand extended to the frightened, the weary, the lost. And though I had not believed him then, caught up as I was in the simple certainties of youth, I found myself wishing desperately that his words had been true, wishing that somewhere far above the smoke-filled sky, a distant presence waited with arms open wide for souls like mine. My breath wavered again, a faint hitch that made my vision blur at the edges, and in that blur the world seemed to dissolve into soft light, pale and trembling like dawn reflected on a quiet river. And though I knew it was only the dimming of my own sight, I allowed myself to pretend, just for a heartbeat, that the Emperor's light had reached me at last. I whispered silently into that imagined glow, offering up everything I had been too afraid to say in life. The regrets I had carried like stones in my chest, the names of those I had loved and lost, the quiet apology for every moment I failed to be brave, gentle, or kind. I told him of my fear, not of dying but of being forgotten, of becoming one more faceless casualty swallowed by the endless churn of war. And in the same breath I asked, softly, uncertainly, that if he could not save me, he might at least remember the small life I had lived, the fragments of hope I had carried into battles that had long since burned away. And somewhere in the fading distance of my mind, I felt something shift, not a voice, not a presence, but a soft easing of the tightness I had held inside my chest since the moment I fell, as though the universe itself had exhaled and allowed me a final measure of peace. My breath grew shallower still, each inhale a fragile thread pulled taut, each exhale a quiet surrender, and with every weakening pulse I felt my prayer drift upward like a faint wisp of smoke rising from a snuffed candle. I did not know if it would reach the Emperor, if anything ever truly did. But in these last moments, it was enough to believe that my whisper had been heard by someone, by the ghosts who lingered, by the memory of my family, by whatever lingering warmth existed in a galaxy drenched in cold duty. As the light continued to dim, softening into a gentle darkness that wrapped itself around me like a worn blanket, I allowed the final words of my unfinished prayer to slip quietly from the fading corners of my consciousness. Please take what is left of me and make it mean something. And with that thought, fragile and uncertain yet entirely mine, I let the silence settle once more against my skin. From the moment my prayer faded into the dim quiet of my thoughts, and the world settled once more into the soft hum of dying light, time loosened its grip on me, unraveling into long, languid threads that drifted across my awareness with the slow inevitability of dusk settling over a forgotten field. And in that unraveling, I discovered how the final hours of a life do not pass as hours at all, but as strange, weightless spans where the mind floats free of the rhythms it once trusted. At first, I thought only a few minutes had slipped by, just enough for a breeze to shift the smoke, or for a distant detonation to echo faintly across the battered hills. But the light above me had changed, softening into a deeper gray that hinted at evening or dawn, and the realization that I could no longer tell one from the other settled inside me with a quiet ache, because for the first time I felt genuinely unanchored from the world I was leaving behind. The pain in my wound had become a distant throb, the kind that feels more like memory than sensation, and even the cold seeping into my limbs seemed gentler now, as though the earth beneath me had decided to gather me slowly into its embrace. Somewhere in that drifting half-awareness, I listened to my own breath, thin, fragile, drawn with effort, and marveled at how long a single inhale could stretch when the world around it had slowed to match the fading rhythm of a dying heart. Time expanded so strangely that thoughts which should have lasted only seconds stretched into long, wandering paths. I remembered sitting alone during late watches, time crawling so painfully that I once believed those hours to be the longest a man could endure. But compared to these twilight moments, even those sleepless vigils felt swift and bright. I found myself thinking of the night sky on my homeworld, how the stars had looked like small pinpricks in a vast blanket of black, and how I had once wondered what kind of lives unfolded out there, never imagining that mine would end on a world I had never heard of until the day we were deployed. I remembered the way the moonlight had spilled across our settlement, pale and soft, weaving through the thin curtains that hung in our windows, and how I had lain awake some nights listening to the distant creak of the windmills turning in the cool air, small, humble sounds that had felt eternal, far more permanent than I ever expected to be. These memories stretched out like long shadows in the dim light of my fading awareness, and I followed each one slowly, as though walking barefoot across familiar ground that had grown strangely quiet. The battlefield around me hummed occasionally with distant noise, but it no longer felt like war. It felt like echoes, remnants of a world I was slowly slipping out of. A faint clang of metal, a far-off shout, the soft rush of wind over broken stone. Each sound lingered far longer than it should, as though time itself had thinned and stretched enough to catch even the faintest noise and hold it gently before letting it drift away. I wondered if hours were passing, or if I was simply drifting in the long space between heartbeats. The lines between seconds blurred so completely that I could not tell if my eyes had closed for moments or for entire spans of daylight and dusk. Once I opened them and found the sky tinted with a faint violet hue, and for a moment I thought night had fallen. But then the haze shifted, revealing only smoke refracting the last remnants of daylight. Or perhaps it was morning, or perhaps neither. The world no longer seemed concerned with keeping time for me. In that strange suspension, I felt something close to clarity, not the sharp, urgent kind that arrives in moments of decision, but a soft, contemplative clarity that rises only when the body is no longer capable of rushing toward anything. I thought of promises I had made and forgotten, of small hopes I had set aside for duty, of the quiet, unremarkable dreams that had once shaped me before the regiment claimed every corner of my future. I thought of the books I had planned to read upon returning home, the letters I meant to send, the forgiveness I had hoped to earn from someone I had wronged long before I left for war. Each thought unfolded slowly, like petals opening to a sun I could no longer see. And though there was sorrow in them, it was a gentle sorrow, softened by resignation rather than sharpened by regret. The ghosts who lingered near me had grown quiet. Their presence felt only as a faint warmth at the edge of perception, as though they knew these hours belonged not to memory or fear, but to the soft contemplation of a life nearing its end. I let my thoughts drift between them and the fading world, feeling neither bound nor lost, simply suspended in a space where time no longer had meaning. My breath grew quieter still, each inhale stretching into the next with the slow inevitability of a tide that knows it will eventually recede for the final time. And as the light around me dimmed once more, perhaps from the lowering sun, perhaps from the narrowing tunnel of my own awareness, I let myself rest fully against the earth, not fighting to stay present, not yearning to slip away, simply existing in the long, gentle hours that stretched beyond anything I had known in life. In those hours, I realized something small and strangely comforting. The end of a life is not a moment but an unfolding, a slow unwinding of breath and thought, an easing into stillness that feels less like falling and more like drifting toward a distant shore whose sands I could almost feel beneath my tired feet. From the moment the long, stretched hours softened into something quieter, something that felt less like time passing and more like a gentle unwinding of everything that had ever held me upright, I felt fear begin to slip from me. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but the way a tightly clenched fist loosens one finger at a time, until eventually the hand forgets it was ever holding anything at all. Fear had lived inside me for so long that I had worn it like a second skin. The fear of failing my regiment, the fear of dying nameless on some distant world, the fear of not being brave enough when the moment demanded it, the fear of remembering too much, of feeling too deeply, of letting myself hope. But now, lying half buried in the cool soil of a battlefield that had forgotten my name, I felt that old companion begin to fade, not because courage had suddenly filled its place, but because the edges of fear no longer held meaning in a world growing softer and dimmer with each passing breath. At first it confused me. I waited for the familiar spike of anxiety, for the sharp, instinctive dread that had so often pulled me back from the brink during long marches and desperate firefights. But my mind only drifted gently, like a leaf carried by a slow-moving stream. I tried to summon the fear deliberately, to remind myself that I was dying, that the darkness at the edge of my sight was not a passing shadow, but the true shape of the end creeping closer. But even that effort felt distant, as though I were trying to hold water in cupped hands only to watch it slip through my fingers. The battlefield sounds came to me faintly now, softened by distance or by the slow dimming of my senses. A distant explosion rumbling like a faraway storm, the muffled clatter of debris shifting in the wind, the occasional crack of lasfire growing rarer, as though the war itself were growing tired, losing momentum, unable to maintain its own fury. Even the voices, once sharp, frantic, desperate, had thinned into faint echoes, blurred beyond recognition, no longer calling orders or warnings, but fading into the soft murmur of a world that no longer required my attention. And in that softened soundscape, fear could find no foothold. I felt my thoughts drift inward instead, not with panic, not with urgency, but with a calm curiosity, as though I were exploring a quiet room where all the sharp edges had been gently sanded down. I remembered nights when fear had been a constant whisper in my ear, nights spent lying awake on cold cots, listening to distant artillery and wondering if the next shell would fall too close. Missions where every footstep felt like an invitation to death. Moments in the trenches when the darkness between shots felt alive with unseen enemies. Fear had been a teacher then, a harsh one perhaps, but a teacher all the same, reminding me that survival required vigilance, that life in the guard was not an inheritance but a narrow ledge we walked with trembling balance. But now, as my breaths grew slower and my heartbeat softened into a faint, irregular tapping, I understood something I had never allowed myself to truly consider. Fear survives only when the future is still possible, when the mind can still imagine the shape of what comes next. And here, where the future had folded into a small, quiet point, Fear had nothing left to cling to. In its absence, a strange tenderness took root inside me. Not joy, no, joy was far too bright an emotion for a moment like this, but something gentler, a soft acceptance that drifted through me like the hush that follows a whispered lullaby. I felt the earth beneath my back grow cooler, felt the weight of my own body lighten as sensation faded from my limbs, and with each inch of numbness that spread, I felt myself relax a little more, as though the soil itself were coaxing me into rest. I remembered then the first time I had ever been truly afraid. A childhood night when a storm shook the rafters of our small home, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling so loudly it felt like the world might crack open. I had hidden beneath a blanket, trembling uncontrollably, certain the storm had come for me. My mother had found me there, shaking, crying, desperate, and she had held me close, whispering that storms pass, that even the fiercest thunder softens if you wait long enough. I had not thought of that night in years, yet the memory returned now with a softness that warmed the fatting edges of my awareness. And as I lay here, the storm of war rumbling faintly in the distance, I realized her words had been truer than I'd ever understood. Even the fiercest things lose their shape when the end draws near. Fear, too, is a storm that eventually exhausts itself. A faint breeze brushed my cheek, carrying with it the scent of dust and smoke, and I felt myself turn inward once more, letting the quiet settle deeper into my chest. Thoughts drifted past like slow-moving clouds, unhurried, unafraid, each one softer than the last. The faces of comrades now long gone, the half-forgotten melodies of songs sung during long marches, the warmth of shared fires in cold encampments, the rough feel of gloves passed from one soldier to another when supplies ran low. All of these memories rose without sharpness, without regret, as though the mind itself refused to cling too tightly to anything now, knowing that clinging was no longer necessary. My breath hitched once, then steadied, faint and shallow. The world dimmed further, its colors softening into muted tones that blurred like watercolor left in the rain. And as my vision narrowed to a thin band of pale sky above me, I felt the last traces of fear drift away entirely, not banished, not conquered, but simply dissolved, as though it had never been more than a shadow cast by a light that was now quietly fading. In that peaceful surrender, I realized that the end did not feel like falling. It felt like releasing a weight I had carried for far too long, a weight I had been too afraid to set down while I still believed I had miles left to march. And now, with the march behind me and the quiet ahead, I let my breath slow, let my thoughts loosen, and allowed myself, for the first time in my life, to feel utterly, unshakably unafraid. From the moment fear dissolved into that soft, receding tide and left my mind open like a dimly lit room, the thoughts I had spent years holding back began to drift in, slowly, cautiously, like shy visitors unsure whether they were welcome. And I found myself too weak, too tired, too close to the edge of silence to turn them away as I once did. These were not the grand regrets of failed missions or the heavy shame of moments when courage faltered, but the small, intimate truths I had kept buried beneath duty, truths I had never spoken aloud even when nights grew long and restless, and the company of my own thoughts became almost unbearable. At first they came as faint impressions, the quiet bitterness I felt whenever promotions passed me by, even though I had pretended not to care, The way my heart had tightened whenever I saw comrades writing letters home, knowing I had no one left to write to. The envy that flickered inside me during moments of camaraderie I could never fully join, always standing a step outside the circle, always pretending I preferred solitude. These thoughts settled gently into the dimming corners of my mind, not as accusations, but as soft reminders of the small, human frailties I had spent so long trying to hide. I remembered then the young woman I had once intended to say goodbye to before leaving for service. The way she had looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope as she realized I could not bring myself to speak the words she needed to hear. I had walked away instead, telling myself it was better to leave quickly, cleanly, without the weight of promises I might never return to fulfill. Yet now, lying half buried in the cooling soil of a battlefield that would never know her name, I felt the ache of that unfinished moment rise within me, not sharp or punishing, but gentle and sorrowful, like a lullaby played for a child long since grown. I wondered what had become of her, whether she still thought of the boy I had been, whether she had found someone kinder, braver, or simply wiser than I had ever managed to be. Another memory drifted in, this one small, almost embarrassing. The day I broke a ration tin during my first deployment and had been too afraid to admit it, hiding the mistake by pretending I had lost it in the mud. It was such a minor act, such a trivial cowardice, and yet here at the end it came to me with strange clarity, reminding me of all the little moments where I had been less than I wished to be, less than the stories soldiers tell about themselves in the quiet hours when no one else can judge them. These memories did not hurt me now. They floated through me like leaves on a calm stream, carried by currents I no longer had the strength to resist. I remembered the man I had once vowed to become, a man stern and brave and unshakable, and how far I had fallen from that dream, not through failure, but through the slow erosion of self that war brings, each act of survival scraping away another layer until only the barest shape of the original remained. I remembered hunger, too, the kind that gnawed through the night in frozen encampments, the kind that made a man think thoughts he would never admit in daylight, and how I had always tried to hide my shaking hands in the morning so others would not see how badly the cold had taken me. I remembered the sound of laughter echoing through the barracks on nights I had slipped away to sit in quiet corners, pretending I preferred solitude, when in truth I simply feared I had forgotten how to belong. And then came the memory I had avoided most, the face of the comrade I had failed to save, his eyes wide not with accusation, but with the helpless plea of someone who still believed rescue was possible. I had carried the weight of that gaze through every march, every deployment, telling myself that survival had not been a choice, but an accident of timing and terrain. Yet now his eyes returned to me with a softness I had not expected, as though even in memory he forgave me for the moments I was too weak, too slow, too human to change the course of fate. These were the thoughts I had tried hardest to avoid, not because they were too painful, but because they were too honest, too revealing, quietly shaping the truth of the man I had been beneath the armor and the rank and the long, grinding duties of the guard. And here, at the fraying edge of life, they came without shame, without urgency, simply settling beside me like old companions who had waited patiently for the moment when I could finally let them speak. My breath fluttered faintly, each inhale thin as a whispering breeze, and the world above me dimmed into hues that no longer told me whether it was evening or dawn, only that the light was fading in tandem with my own dwindling awareness. The soil beneath my back felt cooler now, its embrace steadier, almost protective, as though the earth itself recognized the confessions rising within me and held me gently so I would not drift away before I had let them take shape. I felt a tremor in my fingers then, barely perceptible, like the last flicker of a candle before it gutters. And with that tremor came a strange peace, a quiet understanding that the things I had spent so many years suppressing were not burdens after all, but the final traces of my humanity easing their way to the surface so they could leave me unburdened in the end. The ghosts around me remained silent, but their presence felt warmer now, less like watchers and more like witnesses who understood that these fragile thoughts were the truest parts of me, the parts that had never found space in life but could finally breathe here, in the slowing moments between heartbeat and stillness. And as these last confessions drifted softly through me, I felt an unexpected tenderness settle in my fatting chest, a tenderness for the boy I had been, for the soldier I had struggled to become, and for the man I now understood myself to be, flawed, frightened, hopeful, and deeply, quietly human. With a breath that trembled on the edge of exhale, I let those final unspoken truths linger in the dimming space of my awareness, knowing they would be my last companions as the darkness drew closer, gentle and patient. From the moment my final confessions softened into the still air and the weight of them eased gently from my chest, I felt the world around me begin to contract, not suddenly or violently, but with the slow inevitability of dusk closing its fingers around the last traces of daylight. And my vision, once stretched wide enough to hold sky and smoke and drifting embers, began to draw inward, narrowing until the vast field that had swallowed so many lives became nothing more than a faint blur at the edge of my awareness. It was not darkness that encroached upon me first, but a kind of soft blurring, as though a thin veil had been drawn across my eyes. Shapes lost their definition. Colors melted into muted grays and pale washed-out tones, and even the movement of drifting ash seemed to slow until each fleck hung suspended in the air like a frozen fragment of a world already beginning to forget itself. Sound followed soon after, distant explosions thinning into faint tremors, shouted commands dissolving into muffled murmurs, the hum of war fading into a quiet so deep it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath in anticipation. And in that narrowing silence, I felt a strange clarity settle over me, the kind that does not sharpen details, but rather strips away everything that never mattered, leaving only a slim thread of truth stretching between what I had been and what I was becoming. At first I feared the narrowing, feared that the shrinking circle of vision meant panic, meant suffocation, meant losing even the small scraps of the world I had clung to during these long, dying hours. But instead of fear, something else rose in me, a soft, almost reverent attention, as though the mind, sensing its final moments, had chosen to focus entirely, tenderly on the few things still visible. Through the dimming tunnel of my vision, I saw the sky, A thin band of pale light stretched across the upper edges of my sight, flickering through the haze like the edge of a distant sunrise. I could not tell whether it was truly dawn or whether the fading of my senses had simply made the light gentler, kinder, than it had ever been during the battle. Beneath that pale strip of sky, I saw the drifting smoke moving in soft, rhythmic waves, no longer jagged or violent but graceful, as though the war had finally exhausted its fury, and now exhaled its last remnants like a dying beast settling into rest. Nothing else remained clear. The torn earth beside me was only a smudge of dark color. The wreckage in the distance had dissolved into patches of shadow. Even my own hands were no more than faint silhouettes lying motionless against the ground. And yet, in that narrowing field of sight, beauty emerged where I had never expected it. The delicate shimmer of light catching on falling ash, the slow curl of smoke rising like a drifting ribbon, the faint ripple of wind bending the grass in a gentle bow. It was as though the world, in my final moments of seeing, had chosen to show me not the brutality of war but the quiet, fragile poetry hidden beneath it. As the circle of vision tightened further, I began to see things not with my eyes, but with the strange, inner clarity that comes when consciousness hovers at the threshold of fading. Faces appeared, not vivid or distinct, but softly illuminated outlines. Comrades I had marched beside, men and women whose laughter I had carried with me, whose courage had steadied my shaking hands, whose deaths had left small, unhealed hollows in my chest. They did not speak, nor did they accuse. Their presence felt like a gentle acknowledgement, as though they had come simply to stand beside me in this final narrowing. I thought then of my mother, her face the first I had ever known, now rising in memory with such startling tenderness that my breath caught in my throat. I saw the way her hair had curled around her face as she leaned over me during childhood fevers, the crinkle around her eyes when she smiled, the quiet sorrow she tried to hide on the day I left for service. The world narrowed further, and all I could see of the sky was a sliver of pale gold tinged with gray. I thought of her hands then, warm and steady, guiding mine as she taught me to hold a spoon, to tie a knot, to tend a wounded bird we once found trembling beneath our porch. Her hands had been the beginning of my world, and in this closing moment, I wanted nothing more than to hold them again, even if only in memory. My breath faltered, a thin, trembling inhale followed by a fragile exhale, and as the world shrank to a small circle of blurred light, I saw something else, something quiet, almost imperceptible yet profound. A soft glow, not bright or heavenly, but warm, like the faint amber light of a lantern held far down a darkened path. I knew it was not real, not a miracle, not divine intervention, but perhaps the mind, in its final act of mercy, gives us a light to walk toward, something small and gentle to ease the transition from one silence into another. The circle narrowed again, reducing the world to a single trembling line of light stretching across my vision, and in that sliver I saw none of the war, none of the death, none of the desperate struggle that had ruled my final hours. I saw only the faint shimmer of drifting dust illuminated by the last fragment of daylight, floating like quiet stars across the dimming sky. My heartbeat quivered, each pulse slower than the last, and my breaths came as thin sighs, more absence than presence. As the world tightened into the smallest possible point of sight, no larger than the eye of a needle. I felt no fear, no sorrow, only a profound and quiet gratitude that the last thing I saw was not the violence that had brought me here, but the soft, fragile beauty the world had hidden beneath it. And then, with one final, trembling exhale, the point of light flickered and gently, softly went out. From the moment the last thin pinpoint of light closed softly into darkness, and the world slipped beyond the reach of my eyes, I felt no falling, no tearing, no sudden rupture between life and whatever lay beyond it. Instead, there came a stillness so complete, so tender, that it wrapped itself around my fading awareness like a warm cloak drawn gently across tired shoulders. And in that stillness, I discovered that death does not arrive as a stranger or an intruder, but as a quiet companion who has waited patiently at the edge of each heartbeat, each inhale, each trembling hesitation, asking nothing more than a final moment of recognition. My body, now distant and hollow, felt like an echo, an outline made of faint pressure and memory rather than flesh and bone. And though I could no longer feel the weight of the earth beneath me, I sensed its gentle presence, a cool cradle that had carried countless fallen before me and now welcomed me with the same quiet dignity. My breath, once a fragile thread stretched thin across the widening dark, slipped into a slow, fading rhythm, not forced or grasping, but drifting outward like a sigh released after a lifetime of holding tension in the chest. In that drifting, awareness dimmed not with fear but with a soft curiosity, as though I were walking through a familiar house in the dark, guided by memory rather than sight. The ghosts who had lingered with me in these final hours were no longer separate from the stillness. Their presence dissolved into the quiet, becoming part of the vast hush settling over my thoughts. They did not leave. They simply became gentler, their witness shifting from a crowd of shadows to a single, warm impression, as though all their echoes had merged into one soft reassurance. You are not alone. For a moment I wondered if my mind was still reaching outward, searching for the world I had left behind. But the world felt distant now, as though separated from me by a long corridor filled with drifting dust and fading warmth. The sounds of battle, once thunderous, once shaping every decision, every breath, had vanished entirely, leaving only an immense, delicate silence that stretched in all directions, infinite and unbroken. It was in that silence that I felt something stir, not outside me, but deep within the dimming center of my awareness, a gentle warmth rising like the glow of embers beneath ashes. It was not pain, nor fear, nor regret. It felt instead like a small thread of light, woven from every moment of tenderness I had ever known. My mother's lullabies, the laugh of a friend whose name had almost slipped from memory, the warmth of a fire shared on cold nights, the familiar ache of hope that had survived even in the darkest trenches. These fragments gathered with a quiet purpose, forming a single, steady warmth at the core of my fading self, and I understood, instinctively without needing words, that this was what I had left to offer. Not strength, not valor, not some grand, heroic legacy carved into the annals of the Imperium, but a breath. One final breath, shaped by the love and sorrow and quiet humanity I had carried with me through every march, every scar, every lonely night spent staring at stars I never expected to reach. I felt it then, that last breath, resting inside me not as air but as a memory given form, a final offering held gently as if in cupped hands. My consciousness hovered delicately around it, each flicker of awareness dimming a little more as I gathered the last pieces of who I was. I thought of the Emperor, not as the distant, incandescent figure seated upon the golden throne, but as the idea I had carried since childhood, a light in the darkness, a promise that even the smallest life could find meaning in the vast, indifferent galaxy. Whether he truly heard the dying or whether that belief was only a comfort we whispered to ourselves, it did not matter now. What mattered was the act of giving, the simple offering of the final breath I had held in the dimming chamber of my chest. I released it slowly, gently, letting it drift through the fading quiet of my being like the final note of a song sung long after the listeners have gone. As it left me, I felt the last threads of pain loosen entirely, my body dissolving into weightless warmth, my thoughts untangling into a soft, expansive calm. The darkness around me was no longer the absence of light but a vast, velvety expanse that felt almost like a resting place, a deep, silent shore where the turbulence of life could finally settle into stillness. In that calm, I felt a faint echo, whether from memory, spirit, or imagination I could not tell, of a hand resting gently against my brow, its touch neither warm nor cold, simply present, steady, accepting. And a voice, not heard but felt, whispered through the soft, endless quiet, peace. With that word, or the impression of it, my awareness drifted one final time, sinking into a depth that felt less like an ending and more like a homecoming. And as I slipped fully into the quiet, leaving behind the battlefield, the fear, the sorrow, and even the shape of my own name, I let one final thought rise and dissolve like a fading star. Thank you.